Hey, I'm Debbie, and I am an alcoholic. I usually love speaker meetings, except when I'm the speaker. So I get really nervous right before I speak. Jennifer said a prayer with me right before I came up here, so hopefully I'll do what Wallace said I would do. Thank you, Wallace, for asking me, and thank you, Jennifer and Deborah, for riding up here with me. Somehow my Google took us in all these back roads. I don't think they thought we were going to make it, actually, but we did. So let's see. My sobriety date is June 19th, 1988. My sponsor is Debbie D, and my home group is the Midtown group in Wilmington, and it meets on Mondays and Thursdays. Mondays we have a speaker meeting, and Thursdays we have a literature study where we study the 12 and 12, daily reflections, language of the heart, and then if there's a fifth Thursday, we study one of the 12 concepts, or 3 of the 12 concepts. So come, if you're ever in Wilmington, come and see us. I was born in Dayton, Ohio, the oldest of 4 kids, and I grew up in a very average middle-class family. My parents were active in the church. My dad worked every day. My mom was a stay-at-home mom. I have a younger brother and 2 younger sisters, and there was no immediate alcoholism in our family. We were my parents just set a really good example of how to have a good work ethic and to be involved in the church and their community. And I can just remember from a very early age, like 6 years old, just always being full of fear, just worrying about everything. I would lay in bed on Sunday nights worrying about school, worrying about if people were going to talk to me, whose name I was going to get for the Christmas gift exchange, just really random things. Like I would just have these racing thoughts on Sunday nights. And I had friends, but I just never felt like people really liked me. I always felt like if I wasn't with my friends, they were talking about me, or they would decide they didn't want to be my friend anymore. But I was totally consumed with myself. And I kind of had this like homesick feeling in the pit of my stomach, only I'd have it when I was at home. And I would use things like soda, we called it pop in Ohio, sugar, movies, books, anything to kind of fill that hole. So I always had this kind of feeling of an empty pit in my stomach from a very early age. I remember some of my friends, when I was in high school, would start going to parties and they would talk about drinking. And I would always think, well, I'm not going to drink unless I'm going to get drunk. Like I just had that thought in my head. I don't know why. But some of my friends were drinking and I was just like, I'm not going to do that. You know, I'm going to be good in school, get straight A's, just do everything the right way. Because I was a really big people pleaser and I always wanted to get good grades and have everybody think really highly of me. But I went to a party one night, and this was June of, the summer before my junior year of high school, and I had a couple beers, and I just remember those fears and those worries and those feelings just like fell away from me. And it was like I discovered what I've been looking for my whole life. And I could talk to people, I had self-confidence, I thought I was prettier, I thought you were prettier, I could talk to people, I could be funny, and I just thought, oh my God, I can't wait to do this again. And I drank, I had a few beers, I had some cigarettes, smoked some cigars, just whatever was around, and just thought, I cannot wait to do this again. And that was when like I said, I think I was 16, and at the same time that I started drinking, I started driving. So I was a drunk driver from the time I got my driver's license, and it didn't occur to me that it was a dangerous thing to do. It's just when you were out with your friends and you just started drinking, you were going to end up in a car because you had to go pick people up. And my parents let me drive their station wagon. It was this big green Plymouth station wagon. And I'd go around to pick up my friends, and we'd get our party supplies. And back then we had these things called drive-in movies. I don't know if you all remember those, but we would go to the drive-in, and we would park there and drink for a few hours, never watch the movie. And then I would drive home with one hand over my eye. And it never occurred to me that it was dangerous. For me, once I took alcohol into my system, I never thought about how much I was going to drink or what I was going to do. It was like alcohol made all my decisions for me. And I was a party girl, or I became a party girl. And those kind of morals and standards that I'd had when I was younger just kind of fell away from me. And I had to kind of change my morals a little bit and kind of, just reflect on myself and just decide, no, I'm not going to be that person that I thought I was going to be. And so when I would do things when I was drunk and maybe do things with your boyfriend or say things that was inappropriate or do things that were inappropriate, I would just kind of push those things down and just act like it didn't bother me and that I had intended to do those things. And I was a blackout drinker from a very early age as well. And it was pretty horrifying to hear from my friends what I had done the night before. But it was almost more horrifying when they wouldn't tell you what you'd done. Like, I hated that. When I would do things and they wouldn't tell me what I did, that was even worse. Because like I said, when I was younger, I had a really active imagination. And my imagination, I could have relationships with people in my head and never even speak to them. My mental abilities and my imagination was so powerful. So pretty much I was a mess all through high school, and I lost boyfriends, I lost girlfriends just from the way I behaved when I drank. And I wouldn't understand why people would get mad at me because I did not intend to do those things. Didn't you understand it was the alcohol's fault? I always blamed it on what I was drinking. And at the end of my senior year, when people are talking about going to college or what they're going to do after high school, I really didn't have any goals. I don't remember a high school guidance counselor ever talking to me about college or anything like that. My big goal after high school was to go to Myrtle Beach for a week. That was my goal. And me and some girlfriends did that. We went to Myrtle Beach and we had a great time. And it was one of those weeks when I drank that really nothing bad happened. Like, to me, that was a successful week. Like, nothing really bad happened. And I always thought of myself as a social drinker, but the idea of just having one or two beers was nothing I had ever done in my life. Like, from the time I started drinking, I would have 2 beers while I was taking a shower, getting ready to go out and drink. And that was another thing. When I was out with my friends, there was never enough. And I'm kind of the same way today. If I'm in a restaurant and I'm drinking my club soda and the glass gets down to half empty, I get nervous. Like, I need more. And that's how I drank. Like, I always had to have a supply of alcohol somewhere because I would drink yours and then I would get my stash out and drink mine. So it was like I intuitively knew from the very beginning that it was never going to be enough. So I always had to make sure I had more. And of course I wasn't legal, so I had to find ways to get alcohol. But anyways, after I got out of high school, I started a job and I met a guy, and it was basically a one-night stand that lasted for 3 years. What we had in common was we both loved to drink. And he drank more than I did, so a lot of the focus was on his drinking. But what it really did for me for those 3 years is kept me off the streets. We were drinking at home all the time. And I thought this was the person I wanted to marry. And I remember during basketball season, we'd be sitting there drinking, and our drinks are like large tumblers with a little bit of orange juice and a lot of vodka. And we'd be sitting there drinking, watching basketball, and I'd be doing cross-stitch on the couch, just thinking, I've arrived. Like, this is great, you know. Like I said, alcohol made all my decisions for me, and I was very aimless. I was like one of those pinball machines. I just kind of went where the next good idea took me. And my ideas that I would come up with when I was drinking were not really good ideas. So anyways, we stayed together for 3 years, then we broke up, and then I started totaling cars and having some really bigger consequences for my drinking. And I remember one year I got 2 DUIs in the same year, and it was the same police officer that arrested me. And he remembered me the second time. And after the first DUI, I went to one of those driver intervention weekends to learn about the effects of alcohol and get all this education. And, you know, my decision from that was to drink but not drive. That was my solution. And then, like I said, that fall, I got my second DUI, and that was a little bit more serious. I was looking at possible jail time. And I got a lawyer. Luckily, my sister's boyfriend's dad was a lawyer. He was a corporate lawyer, but he was a lawyer, so he was going to help me out with that. And he got me 10 days in treatment instead of 10 days in jail. Because that was, you know, it's like I was not willing to go to jail. Like, I thought, oh my God, that would be the worst thing that could possibly happen to me. But it didn't occur to me that when I got behind the wheel, drinking and driving, that I was breaking the law. Because for me, rules didn't apply to me. They might apply to you, but I was always the exception to the rule. That's how I thought in my mind. But after I got my second DUI and I had my court date and I knew I was going to go to treatment, I started doing some self-reflecting, and I realized the reason I was getting DUIs is because I never went to college after high school. That was my problem. So I decided I need to go to college. My brother and sister had already graduated from high school, and we're already attending college at the University of Cincinnati. So I basically chose the college based on where they were going to school. And I think I was at a comedy club one night, and I heard the comedian talk about communications majors. So that's how I decided my major in college. Well, no, that's a lie, because my first major that I chose was pre-law. Because of all my experience in the court systems, and LA law was really popular back then, so that's what I was going to be, a lawyer. Like, I was so delusional. I hate to study. I still hate to study. So I don't know what I possibly thought I was going to do going to law school, but it sounded like a great idea. And anyway, so January came, I went into treatment, and the whole time between my court date and treatment, the way I controlled my drinking was to stay home and do laundry and not go out to the bars, because I could not just have 1 or 2 drinks. If I absolutely knew I could not get drunk, or I absolutely had to be somewhere the next day, it was easier for me to go out with my friends and drink Diet Coke all night than to just have 1 or 2 drinks. I just physically couldn't do it. But I wasn't an alcoholic because I didn't drink at home, and I didn't drink in the mornings or any of those things. So anyway, I went to treatment, and in the treatment center, they gave us big books, and we read the big book, and we had speakers come in and talk about the steps. And I felt really sorry for those people. I thought, oh my God, going to AA, that just sounded like a horrible, horrible existence. And but we went to these meetings, and we read Bill's story, and I thought it was the most boring story I've ever read in my entire life. And the cure for insomnia, anything in that big book was, to me, the cure for insomnia. And I remember we had to write down all the horrible things we did. And when I used to tell my story, I'd go into a lot more graphic detail of those horrible things, but I don't do that anymore. But I wrote down all the horrible things that I had done, and we read them to each other. And I remember me and this other girl would just cry through the whole thing. So I guess I worked the first 4 steps while I was in treatment. And after we got out of treatment, I was supposed to continue on to AA, and I was supposed to get a sponsor and do all those things and go to aftercare. And at this time, I was working at a bank and getting ready to go to college in the fall. And I really got into physical fitness. Me and my friend Tracy were going to go to college in a few months. And we actually were going to go to Daytona Beach also that spring. And I would go to some meetings because we had to go to get our paper signed. And I just remember seeing the steps on the wall and hearing them read them at the beginning of the meeting, and having no idea that those were a way of living, or those were a design of living that people followed to stay sober successfully and to find a power greater than themselves. And, seeing the word God in the steps kind of horrified me, because I was raised Catholic. I'm still a Catholic today. And I knew I was in big trouble when it came to God. So, I really kind of didn't want to hear anything about God. And I never got a sponsor. And I just went to a couple meetings because I had to. So, like I said, I went to Daytona Beach, had a great time, didn't drink, didn't know that maybe if you're trying to stay sober, going to Daytona Beach is not a good idea. I don't recommend it to people. But for some reason, I didn't drink while I was there. And came back, and I was out with my friends like I always was. And we went to the bar one night like we always did, and I'm drinking my Diet Coke. And the thought just crossed my mind. And I'm reading through the book with the sponsee, and we're reading the section in the italics where it talks about putting whiskey in our milk. And those thoughts just come like, I need a highball with dinner, after dinner or whatever. And the thought came to my mind, a beer would make this so much more fun. And I don't know where that thought came. I had no intention of drinking that night, but I had a beer. And I had another one, and the AA police didn't show up. The room didn't stop. Everyone didn't stop and look at me. And I thought, oh my God, I'm a social drinker. This is what I always wanted to be, a social drinker. And I went home that night. Nothing bad happened. I was in a wedding the next day. So I got to celebrate my newfound social drinkiness. So I started drinking early. And thank God they didn't have video and stuff at that time, because I said some really embarrassing things to the groom. I think on the dance floor in front of everyone, if it doesn't work out with her, give me a call. And I mean, when I drank, things would just come out of my mouth, and I would come out of a blackout, and I'd be in a situation doing something or saying something, no idea, because I wouldn't say that if I was stone cold sober. But when I drank, I had no inhibitions and I had no filter. And I just remember that night, and it was not, to me, it was not too unsuccessful, because I did make it home with all my clothes on and my purse and my car and all that stuff. But, again, here I am in the same position I was 5 months before. It was like no time had passed. I just started right where I left off. But in my mind, I'm a social drinker now. But I didn't tell my parents that I started drinking again. And my brother and sister knew, and they were keeping it a secret from my parents for me. And that summer, I just kind of, drank when my parents weren't around, or didn't let them know that I was drinking. And then in that fall, I went off to school. And it just started out really slow and quiet. And after a few months, I started finding people that drank like I did, and I was in the bars all the time, and I was just a mess, and I was a barfly, and it was like nothing had changed. And none of that information about the AA or the steps or Bill Wilson, none of that came to me, because I didn't have any relief from my alcoholism. I never got a sponsor. I didn't work a single step, and I just didn't know. I was so delusional. I just thought, well, I don't know what I thought. And it was one of those things where I knew it wasn't a good idea that I was drinking, but I was willing to take the consequences because alcohol was the only thing that made my skin stop crawling. And it was the only thing that would stop that homesick feeling that was in the pit of my stomach. I made it through my first year of college. I was a mess. I was drinking every night, staying out all night, going to my 8 o'clock class, and then coming home and sleeping in the afternoon. So I basically was like a vampire. I only came out at night. And I would hang out with people that I normally wouldn't speak to. And then when I was on campus, I'd walk around with my head down, so ashamed and worried about who saw me the night before. And just of the things I did, I was just humiliated by. But I worked in the history department, and the secretary there loved me so much, she offered me a job all summer. So I was going to stay in Cincinnati, work all summer in the history department, because I was like that Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in the big book. I could keep it together during the day, and I could appear to be a good worker and a good, upstanding citizen, but at night I became a barfly, so I was like living a double life. And I came home for Father's Day weekend, and I must have had my license back by this time because I was driving, and I went out with my friends, and my girlfriend said she tried to keep me home and tried to stop me from driving, but once I get in a car, I want to drive, or once I start drinking, I want to drive your car. You know, I'm just like the ever-ready bunny. I just keep going, and I don't know where I'm going to stop. And that night, I came out of a blackout, and I was driving around, and the sun was coming up, and I could hear the birds chirping, which I always hated the sound of the birds chirping. But good news, I was driving in my car, I had all my clothes on, my purse was here, I was heading home, and I got pulled over by the police. They took me to the police station, and I had to call my dad on Father's Day morning to come pick me up for my third DUI. And my parents thought I had just relapsed that night. They didn't know I'd been drinking for a year. And I used to keep all these journals and books because I was really into astrology and numerology, just trying to find out like some kind of focus, like trying to figure out what was wrong with me. And I looked back at my diary after a few months, and I realized that I had, when I picked up that drink in the bar, it was exactly a year to the day that I got my third DUI. And I was so angry and humiliated and upset that I got pulled over and taken into the police station, and so horrified of like, oh my God, now I'm going to have to go to prison for my drinking and driving. And that day, I came home and I laid in bed, and my family came in and visited me one at a time, like at a funeral, just visiting the body and paying their respects. And that's how it felt. It felt like, because for one day, I was out of ideas. I always had a plan. I always had an idea. I mean, once I got over the depression of the hangover and feeling horrible, I always had some kind of a problem-solving skills or solution. I don't know if you had that experience, waking up out of a blackout, you don't know what city you're in, where your car is, where your keys are, who these people are you're with, but you have to think fast, and you have to come up with solutions really quickly. So I was really good at that. But for that one day, I didn't have any good ideas. And my parents wanted me to move back home to Dayton, and so they could take care of me, because they always took care of me financially, emotionally, physically. And for whatever reason, I said, no, I'm going back to Cincinnati. And my sister drove me back that night, and they did call my lawyer, because I was going to need a lawyer, and he suggested that I go through treatment again. So I found a treatment center, started going to treatment a few nights a week, worked in the history department during the day, and just feeling like an alien in my skin. You know, treatment can only point you towards that solution. Like, I can't live in treatment. I have to function in society. And they talked about the steps, and they talked about our feelings and all this stuff. And there was a woman who would come out one night a week to talk about the first 3 steps. And the bad news that I learned was that I had to go to AA again and get my paper signed. I had to go to like 30 meetings or some crazy number before I could graduate from treatment. And so I started going to meetings at a place called Oak Street in Cincinnati. And it's this old Gothic-looking building. And if you go there noon, 5:30, 8 o'clock, they have meetings. And they have a coffee bar. They have chairs downstairs where people hang out. And you will see all walks of life at Oak Street. You'll see bikers. You'll see homeless people, businessmen, students. And so I could kind of disappear at that place. But when I went to the 5:30 Big Book meeting, we would read out of the big book. We'd read those chapters out of that book that was written in the 1930s. And it's like, really? Don't you have any more current literature than that? And we'd go around a circle, and everybody would read a paragraph, and I'd sit there and I'd count the people so I'd know what paragraph I was going to read, so I could kind of practice it in my head. So I got something out of the meeting. I got that paragraph. And then when people started sharing, and a guy at my home group said this the other week. We read a chapter out of Language of the Heart. And he shared last, and he's got like a month sober, and he said what he heard out of that book was completely different than what all the people who shared heard. He heard it something different. But when the people in the room shared what they heard and shared their experience, strength, and hope, it was like the chapter had meaning. And that's what it was like hearing that magic happen in the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I'm so grateful for that 5:30 Big Book meeting. I don't think I'd be here today if I hadn't gone to those meetings there and get my paper signed. So it was like my motives weren't that great, but I was hearing stuff. And I was hearing a message of hope. And people were talking about staying sober for a year, 10 years, 20 years. And I was amazed. And then they were talking about the things that they did when they were drinking, and they would laugh about them. And I was so sensitive and self-centered when I came in, still am today, but I was so sensitive, and I didn't think anything was funny. Everything was like, I would take it personal. It would hurt my feelings if you just looked at me the wrong way. And so I didn't share in those meetings, but I was listening. And I started to hear people, and they sounded like me. And I remember after a couple months, I hadn't got a sponsor, but I was starting to think maybe that would be a good idea. And I remember sitting in my room off campus and just sitting in my living room rocking and crying and thinking, you know what, I did not want to grow up to be an alcoholic, but it was starting to look like that's what I was. And I had no goals after high school. And I mean, my goal in college was to be a lawyer, and that was just kind of crazy. But what I heard in the rooms was that there was a way to live without drinking. And I didn't even know if I wanted that, but I wanted to stop getting DUIs, and I wanted to stop waking up with strange people in strange places. That sounded attractive to me. And so I made a phone call. I called that woman that I had met at the treatment center, and that I saw her in the meetings, and she seemed pretty happy, and all her friends all seemed happy. I don't know what everybody was so happy about, because I wasn't feeling too happy. But I called her, and she met me the next night at Oak Street on a Friday night, and we sat downstairs after the meeting, and she talked about what she did to stay sober. And she pretty much volunteered to be my sponsor, and I'm so grateful that she did, because a part of me wanted to get a sponsor, but then a part of me really didn't. You know, I'm pretty lazy, and I just want something handed to me. I didn't want to have to work for it, and it looked like what her and her friends were doing was kind of like work. And so after I agreed to be her to let her sponsor me, she had a list of things she wanted me to do every day: go to a meeting every day, read the Big Book, call her every day, go to something called an institution meeting once a week. I had no idea what that was or what it meant, but everything she told me to do, I said, okay. Because I'm a people pleaser, and I'm going to say yes, and then I'll complain about it later. And so she asked me what I was doing after the meeting, and I said, well, it's Friday night. I'm going to go home and watch LA Law. I didn't have any big plans. And so she invited me to go to another meeting with her, and I thought, that's kind of excessive. You people are a little bit crazy. And so, but I was afraid to say no. I didn't know you could say no to your sponsor. Found out later when I became a sponsor that people say no all the time. So she drove me to this meeting across the river, and it was called Spiritual Fallout, and there was like 200 people there, and they were all talking to each other at the same time, and they were all happy and crazy, and it was a speaker meeting. And after the meeting, we went out to dinner with a friend of hers, and they were sitting there. We were having Mexican, and they were just talking nonstop. And it was the first time I'd been out to dinner with people socially where I didn't have alcohol. I didn't have anything. Like, I didn't have a buffer. I didn't have any kind of social lubricant. I couldn't even speak. I didn't know how people socialized without drinking. I didn't know how you did a lot of things without drinking, because I had not done it. And I only drank for 8 years, but I needed to drink for those 8 years. So she got me calling her every day, and she was willing to pick me up every day and take me to a meeting. Like I said, she was crazy. And I remember she was going to go to a conference, and I didn't know what a conference was, and she said it's where you go to a hotel and you hear these AA speakers, and then you go to workshops, and you go to a dance, and you had me at dance. I will not be going to that thing. Whatever you people are doing without alcohol, I will not be going to that event. And I was like, oh, that sounds, I told her, I said, that sounds like fun. And I'm in my head saying, no, it doesn't. And but she was going to go with 3 of her friends, and I was like, oh, good, I'll get the weekend off. I'll get a break from my sponsor. She's going to go out of town for the weekend. Yay. And she called me the night before she was leaving to tell me one of the girls had backed out and couldn't go, so I could go with them. And I remember, I was horrified. I was like, oh, really? And okay. And so I hung the phone up, and my roommate said, I just said, oh my God, I can't do this. I can't go to this conference with these people and stay in a hotel room with them and go to these speakers, and I'm not going to go to any dance. And my roommate said, why don't you pray about it? And I thought, okay. So I hit my knees literally and said, God, please help me because I'm terrified. And the next thing I knew, I was in a car with these 3 women, and we were driving 6 hours away to Jasper, Indiana, and we laughed the whole entire car ride. And then the speakers, we sat in the front row, and we laughed and cried at all these speakers. And I got to hear the most amazing, powerful stories. And then I went to a dance, and I actually had fun. And I thought, oh my God, there is life after not drinking. Because I was 24 years old. I pretty much thought my life was over, and I was going to become a nun. That's pretty much what I thought. And but what I found is my life was starting to get better. So every weekend was more fun than the weekend before. And that was hard to get used to because I was used to my life continuously getting worse. Things happening, horrible things happening, and having to, kind of just stuff them down. And here it was, my life was getting better. I wasn't having all this insanity and craziness. And I can tell you that I had the most amazing time at that conference. And there was probably 60 people from Cincinnati there, and they all had name tags on. So I finally learned people's names. That was good. And so I came back, and then I had to go to court. And I remember I called her on the phone. I was up in Dayton to go for my court date, and we said the 3rd step prayer together over the phone. And I went to court, and I must have had a good lawyer. And back then it was before Mad Mothers, and they were a lot more lenient on people. But he gave me a year, 2 years probation, a year license suspension, and court costs. And I did not stick around to argue or anything. I just got the heck out of there. And they drove me back to Cincinnati, and I got to go to my home group that night. And I was totally amazed because I was ready. I was ready for the consequence. I didn't want to go to prison or jail, but I was willing to go because I realized then that I'm not a bad person. I was a sick person. And I'm not making excuses that alcohol was the reason I drove drunk, but I wouldn't have been driving drunk if I hadn't been drunk. If that makes any sense. So I came back, and we were working the steps together, and I did my 4th step, and then I did my first 5th step with her on January 1st. And it was an amazing experience. I had never told one person all my bits and pieces. Like, people knew a little bit about what I had done or thought or felt, but no one knew the whole story. And so to tell that to one person was amazing. And where it says go home and sit for an hour and revisit the first steps that you've taken to see if you've left anything out. And I hadn't left anything out. I did have a feeling after that I was going to get struck drunk. It was just a weird feeling. I don't know why I had it. But I did feel more a part of things. I wasn't sitting in meetings squirming when they talked about the 4th step and the 5th step. And it really wasn't that hard. I mean, I procrastinated writing my 4th step, and it took me a lot longer because I procrastinated. But just getting it all down on paper, and I've done many 4th steps since then, because you're not going to do it all perfectly the first time, and you're going to forget about things. I did my sex inventory with her, and then I did my fears. And some of the fears were ridiculous, but it was like, it doesn't matter what they are. All the fears are crazy in her head, but what I found is that she had the same fears, and she had some of the same experiences. And then I decided, I suggested when we were getting to the 8th and 9th step that I probably want to go look up some old boyfriends and start those amends first. And she was like, no, you're not going to go to them first. And she steered me towards some other amends. And I had to go make an amends to the secretary of my history department because I used to take money from the history department. I would always put it back, but I would take it, and I wouldn't even use it to buy alcohol. I'd buy Subway or something stupid with it from the petty cash. And so I had to go and pay her back and tell her what I was doing and how I was sober. And she accepted my amends, and then she wanted to talk about her husband and his drinking problem. And he ended up coming to some meetings. So it was never what I expected to happen. I went to my parents and made amends to them, but it was a real surface amends with them. And it talks about in the big book where we have to sit down and frankly analyze the past. And that came later with my mom and dad, where once some time had passed, I think they really just wanted to see if it was going to stick or if it was just a passing phase, my newfound recovery. They were so grateful. I remember my sponsor would come home for family dinners and met my parents, and just my parents were so grateful. They didn't like the thought that I was an alcoholic because my mom always thought, well, what did she have to do with it? Like, was there something she had done or done wrong? But they were so grateful that I wasn't drinking it that they didn't have to worry about me anymore. So once I started working with other alcoholics, that was a new experience because I thought I had to know all the answers, and it was kind of terrifying at first. But what I realized is that it was just take people through the steps the way I had been taken through the steps. And a lot of women didn't stay sober. They didn't want to do it. I'd get them, they'd start their inventory, then they'd just kind of fade away. My sponsor, I forgot to tell you, she had been taking me into a meeting called The Turning Point. It was a prison meeting for multiple DUI offenders. I was going to that meeting when I was like 3 months sober, before my court date even. And I was meeting people that had had 20, 25 DUIs. And I really, at first I thought I was different than them. And then after hearing them talk and then realizing as I worked through the steps, I was just like those people. I should have had 25 DUIs. I just got caught 3 times. Well, 3.5 because I had another incident, but I didn't get, anyways. So, so going to that, and that was the institution meeting. However, if you were up at Oak Street after the 5:30 Big Book meeting on a weeknight, you would get asked to speak. And I was asked to speak at psych wards, at halfway houses, at juvenile treatment centers. The juveniles were the worst because they did not want to be there. The psych wards were a little interesting because they would sleep through your talk, or they'd be, medicated. I had to speak last Sunday, and there was a guy sleeping in the back of the room, and my husband was sitting on the side. He goes, "Oh yeah, there was another one sleeping also." So I had 2 people sleeping through my talk last Sunday. So you all are doing great, not having real coffee to drink. I'm impressed that you're staying awake. But the process of telling my story, and like I said, I would always go into the gory details when I was telling my story early on, is I got to really kind of hear what an alcoholic I was. And it reinforced the fact that, I was truly powerless over alcohol. The details really don't matter. It's that fear and that emotional terror and bewilderment of like, how could this happen again? Or how can this seemingly innocuous alcohol liquid have this power over me? And that willpower, because I have willpower in other things, but when it came to alcohol, I had no willpower. And so for me, when I came up to my first year anniversary, I was just amazed that I had not drank for a year. And I remember a good friend of mine, Ken, we went to meetings together a lot early on. Our sobriety dates were close in time, and he took me to a family wedding, and his mother made a comment how I was able to look her in the eye and speak to her, and how impressed she was. And I thought, oh my God, nobody has ever said that about me, because I would never look people in the eye. I was always looking down unless I had alcohol in me to give me that confidence. But what Alcoholics Anonymous did is it gave me the ability to stand up and look people in the eye and realize that, I'm not a bad person. I'm just another person here, and help me to be a person among persons, if that makes sense. Because I always felt better than or less than. I've never felt just enough. And working through the steps helped me to do that, and helped me to realize that I'm just me, and that's okay. I don't have to be anything special. I eventually got my own jail meeting, and I was really excited about that because it was very competitive in Cincinnati, and you'd go with someone until they gave you their meeting and got a new meeting. And so my meeting was for females, and it was at a jail, and I could bring in speakers from the rooms. And so it seems like the jails and prisons are a lot stricter here in North Carolina, because we could just go in and out of them where I was from. And but we would bring people to meetings, and I got to hear my story for the first time at one of my jail meetings. The girl who spoke, I didn't know her, but she told my story. And that's the other thing. If you stay here long enough, you'll hear somebody tell your story. And it may be, if you're a female, it may be a man who tells your story, or the opposite. You just never know. So I got really, when I first came into AA, I was terrified of people my own age. I was 24. I was in college. I told my sponsor I needed to drop out of school, and she said, no, just keep going. And my second year of college was completely different than my first year. I actually went to class. I didn't sell my books back, and I actually was physically there for class and participating. And I got involved in some of the events on campus and got to know people on campus, which I'd never done before. And then Cincinnati had a young people's conference called CincyPA. And I remember my sponsor and her sponsor went to one of the CincyPA dances, and you know me, I don't want to go to a dance without drinking, so I was like, no, I'll pass, I'm not going to go. And I remember they came back that night from the dance and just talked about what a great time they had. And when they told me what a great time they had, the thought came to me, you know what, I'm not going to miss out again. If someone asks me to go, I'm going to go, no matter what. And I got involved in the young people's group in Cincinnati, and they were putting on a conference, and I went to one of the meetings, and I just showed up, and they said, we need someone for the entertainment committee. And I just walked in at the right time, I guess, and they said, "Okay, Debbie, you're going to be on you're going to be the entertainment committee." And I didn't know what the entertainment committee did, but I just said, "Okay." So I found out that it's my job to raise the money for the seed money for the conference. So I had to put on events and had to put on dances and get speakers and get a venue and all this stuff. And so we had different events all over the city, and it was the most amazing time. I was so involved in it. I got really active with the young people, and it got me through my fear of people my own age. And I remember thinking my sponsor was so much older than me. I was 24 and she was 30. And when I think about that now, it's like, that's crazy. She's not that much older than me. But at the time, it really seemed like a big age difference. But we also went to conferences. We went to the International Conference of Young Peoples, and that was an amazing experience. 10 of us in a hotel room in a city. We all went to San Francisco, we went to Cleveland, we went to New York, and it was just getting involved in that part of the fellowship was amazing. And again, my life was just getting so much better in spite of me. I met my husband in Alcoholics Anonymous. I was good friends with his sister, and I knew who he was, and she said, "You should go out with my brother." And I'm like, "No," because usually my barometer for a guy that I would date in the rooms was I'd see him across the room, our eyes would meet, we'd have that chemistry, and usually he'd stand up for like 30 days or 60 days or, didn't have a driver's license. I went out with a guy once that didn't have his license, and he lied about it, and I'm thinking, we're alcoholics. Why do you have to lie in the rooms if you don't have your none of us had our license at one time usually, but I found out when we went out to a club and he didn't have a driver's license to show the girl at the door, and I'm just like, really? But those were the kind of guys that I always dated, guys like that. And so I went out with my husband, and we went on a date, and the reason I say that is because I've never really been on a date sober. I'm 7 years sober, never been on a date sober, where I just go out with a guy, then he goes home and I go home. And it was just really weird. And so we did that for a couple months where we just dated because his sponsor suggested that he try doing something different. And I was doing something different too. And it just turned out we had a lot in common and we had common interest. And I had never had that experience before because when I was 16, I was not dating. It was not anything like that. And so we ended up getting engaged and then having an AA wedding. And it was amazing. It was amazing to be sober, because when I first got sober, my biggest fear was, what am I going to do at my wedding? What am I going to do New Year's Eve? I was always thinking of the future. I didn't have a boyfriend when I got to AA, but I was worried about what I was going to do at my wedding. So I don't know, 9 years later, it worked out. So we got married, and then we both loved the ocean, and one of our dreams was to live by the beach. And my sister lived in Wilmington, North Carolina, and we'd go down and visit her on vacation. And so we decided to move to Wilmington. And it was weird. It was so weird to leave a place, not because you had to, or not because you were running away from something, but to go somewhere not because you had to or because you were running towards something, but just because it was time. It was the time to move and the time to go. And I really was so grateful to have that opportunity. When I got to Wilmington, I wasn't that crazy about meetings at first. I was new. Nobody came up to me and shook my hand. They didn't know if I had a day or 20 years, but I had to start over. I had to stick my hand out. I had to get to know people. And Jennifer was one of the first people I met. My sponsor, Debbie, was one of the first people I met. And, Jennifer was all about service. That's all she talked about was service. And Debbie talked a lot about writing inventory. So I thought, okay, I can maybe get along with these people. But my husband, the week after he got to Wilmington, he had a sponsor and a home group, and he was already active and everything. It took a little bit of time before I did all that. But I went to Midtown, and I loved that meeting. It was a great meeting. And then we'd been here in Wilmington for about 4 months, and we got a call. My brother had struggled with bipolar disorder for about 7 years. He had attempted suicide in 92 and had been in and out of psych wards, and we got a call that he killed himself. And that was in March of 99, and it was devastating to my family. We had no idea. You're in the meetings and you hear people all the time talk about wanting to kill themselves. I wanted to die, but I was too afraid to do anything about it. But I was suicidal the whole time I drank. But when we went home for that funeral, it was very devastating. It was, for me, I really questioned my belief in God. I questioned how something like that could happen in our family. Why can I stay sober? And I hadn't really mentioned my relationship with God, which had changed over time. And I believed in God. I hadn't gone back to church or anything. but I believed that, there was a God that was taking care of me. And I would pray and I would meditate and I would put my faith that everything was going to be okay. But when my brother killed himself and we went home for that funeral, I did not feel okay. I did not feel this sense of peace and ease. I felt very disturbed. And coming back from that funeral, I hadn't got a sponsor yet in Wilmington. I was still using my old sponsor. And I was going through the book with Debbie and Jennifer, and I asked Debbie to be my sponsor. And, a lot of that year after my brother